Julia Kristeva from Women's Time, Revolutions of the Word, 1981, pages 167 to 170. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Woman. These few elements of the manifestations by the new generation of women in Europe seem to me to demonstrate that, beyond the sociopolitical level where it is generally inscribed or it inscribes itself, the women's movement in its present stage, less aggressive but more artful, is situated within the very framework of the religious crisis of our civilization. I call religion this phantasmic necessity on the part of speaking things to provide themselves with a representation, animal, male, female, parental, etc., in place of what constitutes them as such, in other words, symbolization, the double articulation and the syntactic sequence of language, as well as its precondition or substitutes, thoughts, affects, etc. The elements of the current practice of feminism that we have just brought to light seem precisely to constitute such a representation which makes up for the frustrations imposed on women by the anterior code, Christianity, or its lay humanist variant. The fact that this new ideology has affinities, often revindicted by its creators, with so called matriarchal beliefs, in other words, those beliefs characterizing matrilinear societies, should not overshadow its radical novelty. This ideology seems to me to be part of the broader anti sacrificial current, which, in animating our culture and which, in its protest against the constraints of the socio symbolic contract, is no less exposed to the risks of violence and terrorism. At this level of radicalism, it is the very principle of sociality which is challenged. Certain contemporary thinkers consider, as is well known, that modernity is characterized as the first epoch in a human history in which human beings attempt to live without religion. In its present form, is not feminism in the process of becoming one? Or is it, on the contrary, as avant-garde feminists hope, that having started with the idea of difference, feminism will be able to break free of its belief in woman, her power, her writing, so as to channel this demand for difference into each and every element of the female whole, and finally to bring out the singularity of each woman, and beyond this, her multiplicities, her plural languages beyond the horizon, beyond sight, beyond faith itself? A factor for ultimate mobilization or a factor for analysis? Imaginary support in a technocratic era where all narcissism is frustrated? Or instruments fitted to these times in which the cosmos, atoms, and cells, our true contemporaries, call for the constitution of a fluid and a free subjectivity? The question has been posed, is to pose it or ready to answer it. Another generation is another space. If the preceding can be said, the question whether all this is true belongs to a different register. It is undoubtedly because it is now possible to gain some distance on these two preceding generations of women. This implies, of course, that a third generation is now forming, at least in Europe. I am not speaking of a new group of young women, though its importance should not be underestimated, or of another mass feminist movement, taking the torch passed on from the second generation. My usage of the word generation implies less a chronology than a signifying space, a both corporeal and desiring mental space. So it can be argued that as of now, a third attitude is possible, thus, a third generation, which does not exclude, quite to the contrary, the parallel existence of all three in the same historical time, or even that they be interwoven one with the other. In this third attitude, which I strongly advocate, which I imagine, the very dichotomy man versus woman as an opposition between two rival entities may be understood as belonging to metaphysics. What can identity, even sexual identity, mean in a new theoretical and scientific space where the very notion of identity is challenged? I am not simply suggesting a very hypothetical bisexuality, which, even if it existed, would only, in fact, be the aspiration toward the totality of one of the sexes and thus an effacing of difference. What I mean is, first of all, the demassification of the problematic of difference, which would imply, in the first phase, an apparent detraumatization of the fight to death between rival groups and thus between the sexes. And this not then in the name of some reconciliation. Feminism has at least had the merit of showing what is irreducible and even deadly in the social contract. But in order that the struggle, the implacable difference, the violence be conceived in the very place where it operates with the maximum intransigence, in other words, in personal and sexual identity itself, so as to make it disintegrate in its very nucleus. It necessarily follows that this involves risks not only for what we understand today as personal equilibrium, but also for social equilibrium itself, made up as it now is of the counterbalancing of aggressive and murderous forces massed in social, national, religious, and political groups. But is it not the insupportable situation of tension and explosive risk that the existing equilibrium presupposes, which leads some of those who suffer from it to divest it of its economy, to detach themselves from it, and to seek another means of regulating difference? To restrict myself here to a personal level, as related to the question of women, I see arising, under the cover of a relative indifference toward the militants of the first and second generations, an attitude of retreat from sexism, male as well as female, and gradually from any kind of anthropomorphism. The fact that this might quickly become another form of spiritualism turning its back on social problems, or else a form of repression ready to support all status quos, should not hide the radicalness of the process. This process could be summarized as an interiorization of the founding separation of the socio-symbolic contract, as an introduction of its cutting edge into the very interior of every identity, whether subjective, sexual, ideological, or so forth. This in such a way that the habitual and and increasingly explicit attempt to fabricate a scapegoat victim as foundress of a society or a counter society may be replaced by the analysis of the potentialities of victim versus executioner, which characterize each identity, each subject, each sex. What discourse, if not that of religion, would be able to support this adventure which surfaces as a real possibility, after both the achievements and the impasses of the present ideological reworkings in which feminism has participated? It seems to me that the role of what is usually called static practices must increase not only to counterbalance the storage and uniformity of information by present day mass media, data bank systems, and in particular modern communications technology, but also to demystify the identity of the symbolic bond itself, to demystify, therefore, the community of language as a universal and unifying tool, one which totalizes and equalizes, in order to bring out, along with the singularity of each person, and even more, along with the multiplicity of every person's possible identifications, with atoms, for example, stretching from the family to the stars, the relativity of her symbolic as well as biological existence according to the variation in her specific symbolic capacities, and in order to emphasize the responsibility which all will immediately face of putting this fluidity into play against the threats of death, which are unavoidable whenever an inside and an outside, a self and another, one group and another, are constituted. At this level of interiorization, with its social and as well as individual stakes, what I have called aesthetic practices are undoubtedly nothing other than the modern reply to the eternal question of morality. At least, this is how we might understand an ethics which, conscious of the fact that its order is sacrificial, reserves part of the burden for each of its adherents, therefore declaring them guilty while immediately affording them the possibility of jouissance for various productions for a life made up of both challenges and differences. Spinoza's question can be taken up again here. Are women subject to ethics? If not, to that ethics defined by classical philosophy in relationship to which the ups and downs of feminist generations seem dangerously precarious, are women not already participating in the rapid dismantling that our age is experiencing at various levels, from wars to drugs to artificial insemination, and which poses the demand for new ethics? The answer to Spinoza's question can be affirmative only at the cost of considering feminism as but a moment in the thought of that anthropomorphic identity which currently blocks the horizon of the discursive and scientific adventure of our species.